It's Monday, and that happens to be the day that I like to talk about monsters. Hello, and welcome to Monster Mondays. I'm Geoff Arbuckle, co-host of the podcast Film Seizure that you can catch each Wednesday at filmseizure.com or at a number of podcast providers online. Now, if you haven't noticed, since the start of September, I've been trying to be a little more mindful to feature some more recent horror and monster movies. Now, I may have always reserved room for Godzilla movies or the Universal classics. This is true. But this year, I may have gone a little overboard with the TV shows or other Japanese monster movies or what have you. I recognize that, and I'm trying to figure out how I want to best move forward with this show. As of right now, we're inching closer to the 250th episode of Monster Mondays, and I want to think about how I take this show beyond that marker. I say all that, and I recognize that I'm going to be talking about a 40-year-old movie today. But look, this is a movie that I think has gained a lot of popularity over the years and has become even more popular in recent years than maybe it ever was before. I'm going to talk about the 1981 Sam Raimi classic, The Evil Dead. The movie is officially dated as a 1981 film, however, that's mostly due to it getting a showing in the Detroit area at the Redford Theater on October 15, 1981. It did not receive wide U.S. distribution until spring of 1983, so in a way this is a 40th anniversary celebration. And what's most notable about this movie is that it was Sam Raimi's first real professional movie. He did do an amateur film throughout the 70s and most recently in 1977 called It's Murder, shot on Super 8 film. And he made that when he was only 18 years old. But shortly after, he had the idea to make this movie about some people who encounter something terrible in the woods. That was a little bit of zombies, a little bit of Lovecraft, and a lot of spooky. In order to raise money for the film, Raimi and friend Bruce Campbell shot what they referred to as a prototype short film for this movie. It's kind of a proof of concept type of picture. Interestingly, Raimi first approached the lawyer of one of his friends to get some funding, and that lawyer was not impressed, but he did give Raimi some solid advice on how to raise money for a film. And that was basically it. He was able to seek out a variety of people to secure the funding and raised roughly $375,000 to make The Evil Dead. Now, I mentioned that I kind of feel like The Evil Dead had become more popular in recent years than it was when I was growing up in the 80s. And that's partially true. Now, hear me out on why I think this. First and foremost, fans of horror in the 80s absolutely knew about this movie once it got wide release in 1983, and of course once it hit VHS in the subsequent years. But there are things about this movie that really kind of stand out from a lot of other studio and higher budget indie horror films. Sam Raimi's style with his close-ups, his angles, his use of different lenses and so forth, the use of stop motion. You know, this is actually an amazingly made movie considering it's a bunch of people in their early 20s making a movie with little to no experience. Now, while horror film fans and various magazines like Fangoria, again, certainly talked about this film, it was the 1987 sequel that really got a lot of attention and was the one that was far more popular when I was growing up. That was the movie that featured the Bruce Campbell that was a little more comedic and making good on his ability to act by doing facial expressions and pratfalls and physical stuff. And that would eventually lead to 1992's Army of Darkness, the third film in this series that is basically just a straight comedy at that point. But let's talk about Bruce Campbell, because as much as Sam Raimi is key to The Evil Dead being a franchise 40 years later, it couldn't have happened without Campbell. Campbell is one of those guys who had some starring roles like in this series, but was mostly a character actor. He has appeared in almost all of Sam Raimi's movies, as the two grew up in the same town of Royal Oak, Michigan, and they met when the two were in high school together. Campbell would mostly go on to appear in horror, science fiction, and comedy films, but he would also get some small roles in some of the Coen brothers films as well, thanks to them also being occasional collaborators with Sam Raimi. Campbell is an incredibly likable and funny guy. Earlier this year, I attended an early screening of the most recent film in the series, Evil Dead Rises, in Cincinnati as part of the Horror Hound Weekend. That was back in March. He was in attendance to speak about the movie beforehand. He was one of the producers and has been a producer of the Evil Dead franchise ever since the beginning. He was funny. He was personable. He knew how to joke with the audience and even razz members of the audience, all in good fun. He has a charisma that is both a star quality, but also someone who could do whatever he wanted at any point in his life because of that personality that he has. He never became a big star, but in the right room or with the right people around, he is a star and a really important figure in modern horror. All of that has to do with his character, Ash Williams, that first appears here in The Evil Dead. The movie begins with 5 friends from Michigan State University on a vacation at a secluded cabin in the mountains of eastern Tennessee. The 5 friends are Ash Williams, played by Campbell, his girlfriend Linda, his sister Cheryl, their friend Scott, and Scott's girlfriend Shelley. On the way to the cabin, they nearly get into a head-on collision with a truck and nearly fall off a rickety bridge before arriving at their destination. They get to this cabin where the wind seems to be pushing a porch swing against the outside of the cabin itself. But that swing stops the moment that Scott finds the key and is about to unlock the front door. Everyone witnesses the strange event, but kind of keep on going with their vacation and just kind of blow it off. Scott checks out the inside, which has all sorts of gnarly but probably useful and typical tools to be found in the cabin or in a cabin in the woods. While the rest of the crew unpack the car, the first night seems to kind of carry on with everyone settling in, but soon Cheryl, while drawing a picture of a clock on the wall, watches it suddenly stop. Then a spooky breeze blows in through the window, and her hand becomes possessed to draw a sinister-looking book. During dinner, the cellar door blows open, all on its own, and Scott goes to take a look. And when Ash follows to check in on Scott, they find all sorts of weird and interesting stuff. Specifically, a book with curious writing and weird and horrific images drawn inside it that has a face on the cover that looks to be bound in flesh. In addition, they find a tape player and a dagger that has a skull on the end of the handle. Ash plays the recording on the tape player, and on it is a man named Professor Noby. Now, he's an archaeologist who had been excavating stuff that belonged to the Sumerians. The book is the Naturom Demonto, which is Sumerian for Book of the Dead. This is also known as the Necronomicon. And on the recording, Noby begins speaking an incantation, and this causes a tree branch to break through the window. Later, an unseen entity watches in through the windows into each of the rooms, and it seems to find its focus to be drawn more specifically on Cheryl, who hears something and then goes outside to see who might be out in the woods. What she finds instead are that the trees are possessed and moving on their own. She's bound by vines and branches, and those things start to rip at her clothes, and eventually she's thrown on her back and the branches themselves begin to rape her. Cheryl eventually escapes, but is pursued by the same unseen entity that was watching her earlier. She gets back to the cabin where Ash asks who did this to her, who was out there, what's going on. He asks, is someone in the woods? And Cheryl says that it was the woods themselves that attacked her. And he doesn't really buy into this, but she demands to be taken back to town, and she's upset enough to for Ash to basically agree to do this. However, when they drive back the way they came, the rickety old bridge they drove over earlier is no longer there. Back at the cabin, Ash continues listening to Nobi's recording, and as he does, Linda and Shelly are playing games with these cards. Linda is basically trying to guess each card, and even though she's wrong, Shelly tells her that she's right. The person who does begin to guess them correctly every time is Cheryl. And soon Cheryl begins floating and looks like a demon and tells them that they awoken them from their ancient slumber and they're all going to die just like the others did. She stabs Linda in the foot with a pencil before attacking Ash and Scott. Scott pushes Cheryl into the cellar and chains the trapdoor shut. Cheryl is still able to open it enough to watch the others and quite often taunts them. Shelly looks out the window of the cabin and believes that there's something out there. And when Scott tries to convince her to get some sleep, the entity crashes in through the window and attacks and possesses Shelly. These things that the girls are beginning to turn into are called deadites. And it's not specifically named in this first film, I don't think, but they're basically Sumerian demons. They can be possessed directly by way of being attacked by the entity in the woods. And they also seem to be, they can possess people by attacking or injuring them. And it's really kind of wishy-washy exactly who will turn into a deadite and who doesn't, but whatever it is, oftentimes deadites start to kind of multiply by possessing others around them. And there is seemingly no way to be unpossessed once you become a deadite. Shelly attacks Scott and scratches his face with her nails, and she then tries to stab Scott with that very Sumerian dagger with the skull on the end of it, but he uses a hunting knife to partially saw her hand off. They watch as the possessed Shelly then chews off her own hand. Scott then grabs the Sumerian dagger and stabs her in the back, and that seems like it does the trick to kill her, but she reanimates again, and Scott's forced to completely chop her body up with an axe. Ash then takes the remains and buries them in the woods. And later, Scott plans to leave to find another way out. But Ash isn't necessarily wanting to leave his sister and his girlfriend behind. So he goes and checks on Linda's wound while Scott leaves. And the wound in her ankle suddenly spreads, revealing that Linda is also now possessed. Scott returns badly injured very quickly and slashed by something, while Linda sits on the floor and giggles at them. And Cheryl continues to taunt them. Scott tells Ash that the trees know and they are alive, and they're not going to let them leave. Linda continues laughing and giggling at the mayhem going on inside the cabin, so Ash tries to slap some sense into her, and he's about to shoot Linda in the face with the shotgun that was in the cabin, but she then reverts to normal and begs Ash to not let quote-unquote them take her again. Soon, we hear Cheryl's normal voice too, but it's all a trick to basically drive Ash nuts. After a fight with Linda that involves her using the dagger to slice his arm up pretty good, he stabs her and plans to dismember her, but just simply is not able to. Instead, he buries her, but of course that isn't going to stop her. As he buries her and then later fights with her yet again that ends with Linda getting decapitated, Cheryl escapes from the cellar. When Ash gets back to the cabin after dealing with Linda, he's basically being tortured by the place itself. The mirror turns into a puddle of water. He hears footsteps overhead. He hears voices. The clock is making weird noises. He sees the entity coming for him, so he has to try to close all the entry points into the cabin as fast as possible. Finally, the possessed Cheryl attacks again, and he's able to block the door to keep her from getting inside. And that's when Scott reanimates as a Deadite too and attacks. As Scott keeps trying to attack Ash and Cheryl breaks her way into the cabin, Ash finds the Book of the Dead and tosses it into the fireplace. As it burns, the Deadites all decompose in glorious stop-motion animation. When the sun comes up, Ash walks away from the cabin, only for the unseen entity to rush toward him and attacks while he screams. So let's get to the 3 things I like about The Evil Dead. First, this movie is much darker than its 2 sequels that come later. There is some real meanness to it. Of course, we have Ash's sister Cheryl being raped by trees in an early portion of the movie, and that's fairly gnarly. But there's nothing about any of these characters in this movie that kind of come off to us as unlikable. And they all become possessed and killed. So if you look at it from Ash's perspective, he is with his girlfriend and his sister and his best friend. And that kind of sucks for him, right? However, despite how dark the movie really is, it's still a fun watch. A lot of this is helped by the inventive shots and the use of stop motion on such a small budget. Raimi has a way to make a movie just look so much different than anybody else, and it's on display here right away. It's wonderfully watchable, despite not exactly wanting anyone in this group of people to die, and even if its own later sequels are made by a far more experienced Sam Raimi. And you know something else? The movie also ends ambiguously. I think we're supposed to buy into the idea that even Ash dies at the end. I mean, man, nobody survives this trip to the woods, and that makes it even that much darker and kind of depressing. Yet a really fun ending and a fun movie to watch nevertheless. Second, I really do like that you think Scott is the main hero of this movie earlier on. When he has to deal with the demonic Shelley, he begs Ash to hit her with an axe, but Ash is too scared to do it. Ash doesn't understand what's happening, and he's not the man of action that Scott displays in the first 2/3 of the movie. The roles reverse at the beginning of the 3rd act, and Scott is now badly injured and is scared of what's in the woods. He begs Ash not to leave him. Ash then has to deal with the fact that his girlfriend, sister, and best friend have all become demons who will never return to who they once were. So we see Ash change from the guy too scared to do anything to help his friend fend off Shelley to then becoming the demon hunter himself. That's massively different than the sequels, where Ash does feel at least a little more capable to deal with the Deadites right from the get-go. Just a nice little bit of fun playing with expectations for those who probably have heard the name of Ash Williams, at least in the world of horror, either by hearing people talk about the character or by watching one of the subsequent entries in the series. Thirdly, I mentioned already that this movie is a fun watch, even if there's a mean streak to it. Also, there's something about the way that Raimi shoots this movie that seems to make everything feel off and weird, that in and of itself is effective, even in its very basic shot setups and framing, because there were other shots that used different lenses and what have you. But the real reason why I think this movie is especially watchable, and definitely the one that I will more likely choose to watch in October during spooky times than the sequels, is that the movie is just loaded with all sorts of imagery and elements that make you think of fall and scary things in the woods. There's fog. That's a must for spooky forests. Blood leaks and then later spews out of pipes and outlets. There's an entity in the woods. We don't ever see that force, but it's there. So those are all spooky times. It looks cold at night, and it should, because there are dead leaves all around on the ground. Nothing puts me in the spooky mood than it actually being October or fall with the world around us kind of dying off to later be reborn in the spring. I saw this movie with my brothers at one of our drive-ins here in central Indiana when they play horror movies in the fall. And it was fantastic seeing it in the complete blackness of a rural Indiana October night. Sure, the movie is kind of crude and made by people who were making their first professional film, but that crudeness of how the movie looks and its overabundance of relying on fog and the dark woods is what makes it a fantastic Halloween watch. That wraps up this week's Monster Mondays. You can catch new episodes of Monster Mondays each Monday morning, or Monday afternoon rather, at filmseizure.com. And you can listen to new episodes of Film Seizure each Wednesday morning at filmseizure.com. But don't forget to follow Film Seizure at Facebook and Instagram and Threads, and subscribe to Film Seizure to get both the Film Seizure podcast and Monster Mondays at your favorite podcast providers, as well as YouTube. You can also check out my website, bmovieanima.com, to read new articles every Friday morning. Next week, we kick off the month of October with more horror monsters that span the course of the last 50 years worth of big budget horror classics, with a couple of smaller films showing what that horror might just be in pretty good hands with the new generation. We'll even pass the big 250 with one of the most important horror films of all time. And that's all part of the 2023 celebration of the month that features the greatest of all holidays. And we get things started with, well, what else? The sequel to this week's movie, Evil Dead 2. So until next week, stay spooky.